The following reading contains spoilers for the Horus Heresy novel, Sigismund, the Eternal Crusader, by John French. Chapter 8. Kin of Midnight. There was smoke coming from the corpse of the city. Sigismund could smell it as the gunship doors opened. Promethium, Plaztech, flesh. Thick, rolling fog up into the blue sky. "Teeth of hell," hissed Ran from beside him. The gunship banked. The city filled the view beyond the open door. Sigismund's boots locked to the floor, his muscles shifting to hold him steady on the sight before him. The roar of the engines was deafening at his back, the growl of a storm. He could see the grid and the wind of the roads, piles of rubble that had been buildings, ragged walls, holes that had been windows, the shadow of the surrounding mountains creeping back across the ground. A slow tide, the new day's light and unkindness to the comfort of shadows, fires rolling in orange and black at the base of columns of smoke. No shellfire, no flicker of tracer, no blink of explosions or raising blasts of dust. Silence. Silence that he could feel through the gunship's din. His eyes found the blue-black shapes of tanks and war machines amongst the ruins, figures on the edge of the fires. "Lock targets," said Sigismund. "Combat deployment immediate." Ran gave a single nod, and then the orders were snapping across the Vox, and the warriors in the gunship were rising, weapons arming. The gunship rose, engines now shrieking, and beyond the open door its kin flashed through the air, squadrons spiraling into the gyre, flares shed from wings and burst into star brightness. And all Sigismund could feel was the coldness within, the lightning of the storm. A small voice, very small and fading, called that he could not do this, that he had to have control, that without that, there was nothing. "Oaths for eternity," called Ran, and the echoes of those words roared from the throats of his brothers. The gunship's nose lifted, and for a moment the view was just of the blue sky and the stars fading in the morning sun. Then the gunship winged over and dived. Shiro, a war long and bitter. The warriors of 5 legions, 3 primarchs, millions of mortal troops, months of the most direct conflict that the Great Crusade had seen. Sieges, assaults, losses, the long, creaking, bleeding pressure of forces that will not be denied beating against the will and strength of people that did not want to submit. Later it would be remembered only for how it ended, for the cracks in brotherhood and the ideology that would see Rogel Dorn bloodied at the hands of curs, and the Night Haunter fleeing into a future of further atrocity. The gilding of glory and honor looked for by Fulgrim's 3rd Legion would turn to a tarnish. It would become a compliance that few would want to remember, and fewer to hold the banner for. In its last stages on the northern, subpolar continent, the final cities and fortresses fell. They fell not as the others had, prized away from those who had held them over weeks and months, but in days, one after another, as the legions struck from air and land. The people of Shiro had fought and resisted, but now found that they were exhausted, broken, human, while those they faced were anything but human. The gunship slammed level above the plaza. Sigismund leapt from the assault ramp. The ground greeted him, impact shuddering through him, and he was moving, going forwards, weapon drawn, his brothers at his side. There were warriors in midnight blue in loose order at the center of the plaza. The Imperial fists did not stop. The gunships shrieked as they fired their engines and punched back into the sky. One of the midnight-clad warriors raised a bolter as Sigismund came at him. A mistake. Sigismund sliced his blade through the weapon, and the shells in the breech in the magazine exploded. The warrior reeled, but Rand's shield was already slamming into him, and the Imperial fists were a wedge driving through to the center of the plaza. A figure in a skull helm turned to meet Sigismund. A crest of skeletal red wings rose from its crown. A chainsword was gunning to life in its fist. Sigismund triggered his own blade's power field in the instant it struck the chainsword. Chain teeth spewed into the air, and Sigismund felt his blade go through the weapon. The eyes in the skull helm were blood red. He cut the power field an instant before the sword struck the dark-clad warrior's crown. Had the field been active, the blow would have parted the crest and the helm and skull, and sliced down through the chest and guts, and blood and bowel fluid would have been gushing out, cooking as it touched the blade in the second before it swept up to meet the next enemy. The naked sword split the crest and cracked the ceramite of skull helm, cleaved it, and there was blood flowing over the skull-painted mask as the warrior staggered. Sigismund slammed a kick into the warrior's chest. Shouts and cries filled the air around him, but that was somewhere else. Some other space where Rand's shield brothers were shoulder to shoulder, the Templars with them. All that Sigismund was aware of was the blood roaring through him, and the thread of will that held the tip of his blade still at the throat of the Night Lord at his feet. A protesting noise was coming from the speaker grill. One push of muscle and will, and Sigismund's sword tip would ram up under the chin of the helm, up and through the mouth and into the meat beyond. "Brother!" Rand's voice, loud and urgent. Sigismund did not move, but suddenly the world flooded back in. "What are you doing?" gasped the Night Lord. Sigismund looked down at him, and then up at the plaza and the smoke-veiled city. Corpse smoke, greasy with fat. Poles ringed the plaza, lengths of metal rammed into the ground. Bodies impaled through hung from them, one stacked on another. Some of the poles had begun to bend with the weight. There was blood in the fountain at the center of the plaza, blood and heaps of fresh flayed skin. "Get your forces out of this battle zone," said Sigismund through gritted teeth. "You are relieved. Do it now." "Relieved?" A sneering voice rose from behind him. "I am not certain under what authority you give that order." Sigismund straightened, turned. The warrior who had spoken was leaning against the scorched remains of a statue, arms folded, a barbed chain halberd resting at his side. His face was very pale, a tangle of scars running through the refined features like cracks through marble. He looked at Sigismund with blackened black eyes. "According to the conventions and rules that govern these matters, I have theater command here. So, unless you bring fresh orders from a higher authority, on behalf of the 8th Legion, I will have to decline your request." "Sevatar!" growled Ran. "Fafnir?" smiled Sevatar, then nodded to the Night Lord still sprawled on the ground. "Krukesh, get up." Sigismund stepped towards Sevatar. The plaza had gone quiet, tense. "What have you done here?" "We have done what our Lord Father ordered. We have done what is needed." "This!" Sigismund pointed his sword at the coiling smoke from the place that had been a city behind the poles. "This is not needed." Sevatar shrugged. "I am not going to argue points of philosophical difference. In truth, I find they are equally as tedious as they are meaningless." Sigismund drew breath, but Sevatar spoke again. "More to the point, they are irrelevant. We have work to do. You can stay, but something tells me you might find it distasteful." Sevatar turned away. Sigismund cut, the motion unfolding in a blink of steel. Sevatar's glaive met the blow, and suddenly both of them were eye to eye, weapons locked. "A strike without warning?" hissed Sevatar between bared teeth. "Isn't that rather against the grain of honor and justice? Please do not tell me I have misjudged you. I would hate to have to like you." Sigismund looked into the black eyes. He held the sword steady. Sevatar's grin twitched. "I noticed that you didn't activate the power field. Was that out of concern for my safety, or are you just trying to make some kind of point? You are noble and just, and I am a cruel killer, or something along those lines? Sevatar's eyes glittered above his grin. "Well, I can save you the effort on two fronts, brother. First, if it had been me, I wouldn't have bothered to swing the blade if it didn't have bite." Sevatar shifted the pressure, locking his glaive with Sigismund's sword, and spun back, fluid and fast. The smile faded from his lips. He looked up at where the nearest corpse hung, arms slack at its sides, uniform black with blood, the tip of the spear projecting up between its teeth. "Second, I simply don't care. Third, even though I swore I would stop at 2, you are deadly and righteous. But this is not your ward, and never was, Templar." Sigismund took a step forward and plunged his sword into the ground at Sevatar's feet. The midnight-clad warriors laughed. Sevatar looked at the sword. "You do want to do this, don't you?" "Here and now." Sevatar rolled his eyes, looked around at the circle of Imperial fists and Night Lords. He blinked and shook his head. "All right." Sigismund pulled the sword from the ground and took a pace back to where Rand stood. A loose circle was forming at the center of the Imperial fists and Night Lords. Rand held out his hand wordlessly to take the sword from Sigismund as he took a length of chain from a pouch and began to wind it around his wrist. He listened to the clink as the links pulled tight. He nodded to Rand as the assault captain held out his sword. "Thank you, my brother, for not trying to tell you that this is a foolish idea," said Rand. "If you weren't here, I think I might have skipped the challenge and just seen how he looked with that grin scattered in the mud." Sigismund fastened the sword to the chain, flexed his fingers, held the blade's weight, felt its balance shift. "I do not need to tell you, but he's quick," said Rand softly. "I saw him against one of the 13th. Not a pretty thing to watch. I would trust him as far as I would a scorpion." Sigismund glanced at Rand, who shrugged. "Just in case you hadn't thought of that." "This is not about who is faster, brother, or stronger," said Sigismund. He put a hand on Rand's shoulder, his voice low. "Disperse our forces into the city. See this barbarity stopped. Send word to the Primarch. He will want words with the Night Haunter." "It will be done," said Rand. Sigismund bowed his head and brought his fist to his chest. Rand returned the salute, and then Sigismund was turning and the world was slowing to the beat of his hearts. Inside his mind he could hear the growl of a storm coming, long ago and far off. Sevatar padded forwards, his movements loose, his spear held in one hand, eyes watching, mouth smiling. "We fight until one yields," he called. Sigismund nodded. "Agreed." The smell of the murdered city filled Sigismund's nose as he drew a breath. "Only blows with weapons," said Rand. Sevatar raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. "They say you have played in the dog pits of the 12th, so I can understand it if you are worried that he might have picked up bad habits. Can't have the Lord Templar in more grubby bras than needed, can we?" Sigismund did not acknowledge the words. He stopped. In his mind he could feel the weight of his sword, The beat of his heart had faded to near silence. Far off in memory, he could hear the rain begin to fall and the wind rattling through the shack doors. "Well then," said Sevatar, stopping in his own stride, reaching down to pull the helm from where it hung at his waist and lower it over his head. A fanged skull gazed back at Sigismund from beneath a crest of crimson wings. The eyes' lenses lit. "Let's get this over with." Sevatar moved. His chain staff flicked out and then twisted into a cut. It was fast, shockingly fast. Sigismund was already moving forwards as he felt it clang from his blade as he parried. He turned the blow and thrust, shifting the sword in one hand, all his weight and speed behind the point of the blade. One hit, one kill. True and pure. Even without its power field, the blow would breach armor and punch into flesh if it struck the right point, and Sigismund had seen the gap open above Sevatar's gut plate. Hit the right place where the plates and cables joined, and the sword would ram into the torso through bone and into the guts within. Not a mortal blow, not for a space marine, but a blow to end this now, enough to wound, enough to leave a mark. But Sevatar was not there. An eye blink, and Sigismund felt his sword thrusting into space, pulling him forward as the chain staff whipped around, cutting across and up and into his own midriff. He turned as the blow came at him and went in close, guard high as he read the spin of Sevatar's weapon, and the two blades rang against each other. Blow after blow, cut after cut, as the sun rose and poured its rays through the veils of smoke. There had been cries and cheers at first. They had gone, replaced by silence. Cut and riposte, the two figures a spiral moving at the center of the circle. And for Sigismund, it seemed as though time and place had gone, as though the sun arching above were rotating around this moment, as though this were the world. Truth and lies, life and pain, all found in the meeting of blades. A cut, a parry. The teeth of the glaive catching the edge of the sword enough to shear it wide, and the blur of the blow slicing into his legs, and the step that would pull him back, sword rising, thrusting into the gap that would come, the glaive coming to meet his cut, the sound of the chain motor gunning to life for a second so that the cutting teeth spun in his sword as the weapons met, the sword pivoting in his grip, shrugging off the deflection to cut. On and on, his heart's a steady drums to the hours. One cut, one kill. True and simple. The first truth he had learned from the sword. True unless the sword would not find its mark, unless the enemy was like Sevatar, cruel and uncaring of ideals, and deadly, and as fast as the snap of lightning between storm cloud and ground. One moment, one mistake, and it would be over. They dueled in silence. At first, Sigismund had thought Sevatar would talk. He would throw words with his blows. But he did not. He simply fought. Not with a sneer or a flourish, but with an intensity that Sigismund had never felt. Focused yet boiling, like the waves of a black ocean, like a storm that would never pass. He would not tire. Sigismund knew that. He knew that this was an opponent who had run and retreated and murdered and fought like a coward in war. But here, in the circle of time, was something else. Something that even perhaps he did not realize. An argument spoken by the touch of blades. This was the interplay of ages, of all civilization at its fall, never repeating in detail, but always in pattern. Death and the warrior, the knight and his shadow. On and on, blades ringing as they sliced away the present forever. This, though, would end, and it would end with one cut. It was almost here. He could feel it, like a light flickering in the distance, becoming clear with each step. A different truth to the one he had thought Apollonius had meant all those years ago. One cut at a time. That's how we create eternity, by making the next cut. From the moment that their blades had locked, he had known that Sevatar would not fall quickly, so he had struck and struck, each time sharpening the edge in his mind, refining his feel for the timing of his opponent, his movement. Soon he would be able to make a single cut, a cut shaped like a key for a lock, and then this would be done. 1,000 cuts to create one. The sun was setting, red and fire orange through the thinning smoke. Another cut from overhead, another turn of his blade, another strike shearing off a parry. And there it was, opening before him, as though it were not him wielding the weapon that would strike, but just observing it coming into being. He took a blow on his sword, felt the force shudder through his grip, felt the halberd slide to the cross-guard, locked and jerked the weapons for a second, then whipped the blade, turning it into an overhead cut that would smash down onto Sevatar's face. Sevatar knew what was happening. Sigismund felt the realization like an electric shock of understanding passing between them, like a blast wave transmitting through water. He knew that in this moment he could not parry, he could not bring his blade to strike. The eyes in Sevatar's faceplate were red coals in the dying light, caught in an unfolding instant that only they understood, brief and eternal. Sevatar dipped his head and rammed the crest of his helm up into Sigismund's face as the sword cut into his faceplate, shattering the skull-painted ceramite in the red islands. Sigismund stepped back, spinning the sword into a guard. Sevatar retreated, pulling his helm from a bloody face. Sigismund could taste the iron on his own tongue, felt the weight in his limbs now. Rare for a space marine. Saw the scoring and chips on his armor. It was night, the light of a new dawn slipping above the teeth of the surrounding mountains. The city was quiet, the fires gone, the corpse smoke fading from the air. "First blood to me," said Sevatar, grinning as his own blood ran down his face. "You forfeit," called Ran. "Perhaps," shrugged Sevatar, "but I didn't lose." He took a step closer so that his words were a whisper between them. "Next time, brother, remember that even if people start out with honor, no one ends up that way." He grinned again. "Take it from me." Sigismund felt a hollow laugh come from his lips. Then he turned his back and walked away. Hey guys, that was Sigismund versus Sevatar from the Horus Heresy book, Sigismund Eternal Crusader. Thanks for listening, and let me know what you thought. See you next time.